We continue today. We continue on the topic of trying to understand Amafarshim, who is asking the question. Today we have the huge responsibility and job of understanding the Baal Haturim. And before we start, I want to take a special moment to thank Dr. Moshe and Rochelle Yeager. Today is actually Moshe's, the yortzeit of Moshe's father, Yoshua ben Avraham, and we're actually about to approach Rochelle's mother's yortzeit, Brindle Bas. Oh, that was actually Baba's Yom on Shabbos, Brindle Bas Yisrael Aryeh Alea Shalom. And all I can say is that Hain in Midos, Hain in Torah, there is no doubt that they are getting a tremendous continued aliyah. And Moshe, thank you for being a role model personally to me and to so many others around you, who in terms of your graciousness, your kindness, your Torah, and your thoughtfulness. It's really, we are so blessed. And Be'ezras Hashem, your parents should continue to get a lichtige Gan Eden. Be'ezras Hashem. Folks, there's a Mazel Tov? There's a Mazel Tov? No, not yet. Mitzvah Hashem.
No, didn't you have
My son gave a Suda Sabas from the year.
Oh, Mazel Tov. Okay, good. Continued. Yeah, so let us. So what we're going to do is, let's jump straight in. And folks, I think that sometimes when people hear that we're learning about the Baal Haturim, the first word that comes to mind is gematria, numerology, right, folks? let me try to disavow you from your understanding and from my previous understanding what the Baal Haturim is trying to do. Because, folks, if you just join me for a few minutes now, you're going to see something, I think, which will change your perspective on Judaism. Forget the Baal Haturim as to what we're trying to accomplish. Let's take a step backwards. So, first of all, who is the Baal Haturim? His name is Rabbeinu Yaakov. He is a person who's a very famous German commentator. His father is Rabbeinu Asher. And just to understand the general framework of their life, the assumption is he's born around the year 1269. Okay, so we were talking the 13th century, don't know the exact date, but he is born in Cologne in Germany. Okay, Cologne is on the western side of Germany, and he grows up into a very rich rabbinic family. His father is one of the leaders of the generation in Germany. But unfortunately, in the year 1303, his father and family is forced to leave Germany. Why? Now remember, Germany is not really a country. It's more of a general empire of the Prussian. It hasn't yet coalesced into a country. But he and his family are forced to flee. Why? Because the writing is on the wall. What happens is the leader of the generation, his name is the Maharam of Rottenburg, Rav Meir of Rottenburg, was imprisoned by one of the local kings in the fiefdom and ransomed to the Jewish community, refused to be ransomed, ultimately died in captivity, and later on his body was ransomed many years later. The Maharam of Rottenburg is one of the leaders of the generation. His student is Rabbeinu Asher, our author's father. Rabbeinu Asher, seeing the writing on the wall, says, we know that great rabbinic figures are next. He picks up himself, he picks up his family, and he moves westwards into southern France, stays in a number of communities on the way. We have his diaries, we can see how Rabbeinu Asher describes this, and ultimately receives an invitation to Toledo, Spain, where he stays for a few months under the welcome of the Rashba, Rashal ibn Aderet, one of the great leaders of the time, and ultimately settles down and Rabbeinu Asher becomes the Rav of, I believe, of Barcelona. And the family, because there are a number of sons, Rabbeinu Yaakov being the third of the sons, sort of settle around and become involved in Jewish rabbinic leadership. So he becomes he becomes a Rav in a small town just outside one of the large towns. But ultimately, it sounds like his predominant contribution is not his rabbinic service to the community necessarily as much, as much as his writings and his scholarship. It's a little bit cloudy as to where he dies. It sounds like he left Toledo and ultimately made their way to Israel, it sounds like. And on the 12th of Tammuz in 503, which is 1343, he passes away. Again, there's different dates as to when he passed away, and his body is brought back to Toledo and is buried near his father and 4 of his brothers in Spain. Okay, so this is Rabbeinu Asher, sorry, Rabbeinu Yaakov. Okay, and he contributes a number of things, and sometimes it's worthwhile looking at, and I don't like to do this because you don't want to limit a person, but sometimes you have certain skill sets that people bring into the Jewish world of academia, of literature, of ideas, and that becomes their thing. They do something which changes the way Judaism is understood. And his, if I may say, superpower is the power of summary. Not gematria, summary. Let me try to drill in what that means. What did he do in his writings? Among the many writings he does is he comments first on his father's commentary. So understand at this point in time, there's a proliferation of explanation of the Gemara, but as it relates to halacha. And there are at this point in time 2 schools of thought as to how to express that. So the one school of thought, which is the more traditional school of thought, is that of the Rif. Rav Yitzhak of Fez in Morocco, who writes the first halachic compendium on the Gemara. And what does he do? He essentially summarizes the Gemaras, omitting the sections that are not halachic today. And then, so it essentially looks like a Gemara. And then he makes little addendums at the end as to what we follow. So if you open up a regular Talmud Bavli today, so at the beginning, the first half is the Gemara. If you turn to the back of every single Gemara, barring the article, which is just sort of a summary, but at the back of every Gemara, it looks like a Gemara, but in the center is actually what's called the Rif. Rav Yitzhak al-Fasi. And he is commenting and summarizing the halachic aspects of the Gemara. What's the school of thought? Halacha flows directly from the Gemara, and we're going to include the halachic concerns, and we're going to exclude the ones which are not halachic. That's what he does. And many of the later generations, the Rif lived, I believe, in the 11th century, around there, and so you notice around him are many commentaries. So on an average Gemara, this is Bava Metzia, you have the Nimuka Yosef, you have the Chidush An Sheshem, you have the Baal Ma'or, the Milchamas Hashem, the Zever Aschus. There are many people who are commenting just on the Rif, right, as this essential halachic compendium. Rabbeinu Asher of Germany, the father of the Baal HaTur, actually also comments, not on the Gemara, but on the Rif. Most people think that the Rosh is a commentary on the Gemara. The Rosh is a commentary on the Rif. Rabbeinu Asher, at the back of every Gemara, and this is every Gemara that has halach in it, has what's called the Rosh. Rabbeinu Asher, standard print in every single Gemara. It's the first thing that comes after the Gemara, is Rabbeinu Asher. What does he do? Similar to the Rif, he takes the halachic works and he divides them into paragraphs. And he says, topic number 1 in this is, starting with Bava Metzia, is splitting the talis. 2 contendants holding onto a hefker talis, and he goes on to enumerate the ideas. He obviously has in front of him, Rabbeinu Asher has in front of him the Tosfos Academy, so he's informed by much of the French academies, the German academies, and he puts this all into the framework of halacha. So how does halacha flow? It flows from the Gemara. It's worthwhile noting there's another school of thought of how to codify halacha, and that is the revolution of Maimonides, of the Rambam. The Rambam also looks at the Gemara, but he says rather than trying to essentially establish halacha based on the system of Shas, Shisha Sadarim, which is the traditional division of the Mishnayos as set out by Rav Yehuda Nasi in the year 200 when he redacted the Mishnah, which divides all of Jewish ideas into 6 sets, right? We have Zroim, we have Moed, Noshim, Nezikim, Kodshim, and Taros. That's the Shas, and the Gemara and Mishnayos are coalesced around this. The Rambam says, it's too complex in this way. I'm going to summarize all of halacha into 14 sections called the Yad, Yud Daled. And in that, he takes the ideas in the Gemara, the ideas of the medieval commentators in the Gaonim, and he puts it into its own framework. Right? And anything which is new is protested greatly. And the Rambam had 4 rounds of book burnings at various times, not just because of his re-establishment of halacha, but it's a lot of new, right? This is all happening around now, right? So we have the traditional coalition of halacha, and we have this new, we'll call off the page division of halacha. So the first thing that Rabbeinu Yaakov does is he looks at the Rosh and he says it's very long. So what he does is, if you go to the back of this, you see what he does is he calls Kitzur Piskei Harosh. He comments on his father, he goes through his father's entire Pirush on the Gemara, and he summarizes it. The Kitzur, I gave you an example. If you take a look on page 2, there is the Rosh, Rabbeinu Asher. That's his father. In his commentary at the back of the Gemara in source 1. And that's, we'll call Aleph. Do you see on top right there it says Aleph? That's the first paragraph. Look on the left, on the right hand side of the column. That's the Kitzur Piskei Rosh in source 3, which is the Tur, Rabbeinu Yaakov, his son. Notice how he summarized the first paragraph of Aleph into a third of the size of that paragraph, right? Cutting down to the essential issues. If you flip the page, that's the second paragraph on the top of the next page, and he's able to summarize it. So the first thing he does is he summarizes essentially using his father's methodology, right? His father was saying halacha stems traditionally off the page, and he summarizes all of that throughout all of Shas, right? The next thing he does, which is attributed to him, is he does the same thing with Tosfos. Every page of Gemara, almost every single folio of Gemara in all of Shas has a commentary called Tosfos. The inner column is usually Rashi, which means the earlier commentaries. Rashi's grandchildren and all associated are in the academies of the Baal Tosfos. They appear on the outer column of every Gemara. So as an example, in source 4, there's a Tosfos at the beginning of Bambatzia. But now, if you look to the right, there's something what's called Kitzur Piskei Tosfos, which is a summary of the halacha, not just the pilpul, which is sort of understanding and contrasting and the ideas. Who wrote that? It is also attributed to Rabbeinu Yaakov. So what does he do? He summarizes the major corpuses of material of halacha on Shas, right? Seeming to move into the general theme of we'll call the traditional view of halacha flowing off of the page. Okay, so that's the first thing he does. He summarizes. So look at source 4 and source 5. You'll see there's a standard Tosfos. And look, in 2 lines, he summarizes the halacha, which is derived from that Tosfos. Okay? And these are found at the back of every standard Gemara. Right after the Gemara finishes, there is here we go. This is an example. Here is Bava Metzia finishing. And at the next page is Piskei Tosfos. And it's very, very short. This is what he is. What were the essentials? What were the Tamtzis Hadvarim? That's what he does. But there's no question that the greatest contribution of Rabbeinu Yaakov to Judaism is the next book that he wrote. After having done this, and after having summarized, we'll call it the essential Mefarshim on the page, he did something which gave him his name, right? Because up to now he was Rabbeinu Yaakov. But then he did something which made him be called the Baal Haturim. Why? Because he wrote 4 books. And those books were called the Arba Turim. This is one of the set, the 4 columns. What does it mean? Now he switched from traditional halacha into the Rambam's new way of looking at halacha. What did he do? After having summarized all the halacha stemming from the page, he said, I'm now going to take all of halacha and I'm going to summarize it in 4 ideas. We call those the 4 conceptual frameworks. And what are those frameworks? Orach Chaim, which includes how we pray, how we say brachas, how we daven, how we celebrate Yom Tov and fast days. All of that falls into one silo called Orach Chaim. That's the most studied silo of halacha today. The next is he goes to what's called Yoreh Deah. He calls it all based on Psukim. Yoreh Deah is the laws of Shkita, the laws of Kashrus, the laws of Avelos, the laws of Talmud Torah, Tzedakah, Gerus, Milah, all of that in that column, in that silo. Then he goes to Choshen Mishpat, business law, all the laws, neighbor law, business law, contract law, agency, all those things belong in Choshen Mishpat. And finally, Even Ezer, dealing with relationship law, marriage, divorce, yibum, everything that fits into that belongs in Even HaEzer. The last 3 being unfortunately less studied. When a person gets smicha in general today, it's what's called Yoreh. Smicha means to say, if you look at a smicha certificate, Yoreh means that there is a proficiency in the most essential parts of Yoreh Deah, right? Then a dayan who sits on a panel usually has to get what's called Yadin, which means they got a proficiency in Choshen Mishpat, right? So that's just understand how this system operates, and of course all halacha interlinks, but in terms of this is the way it works. Now, what does he do in the Torah? What he does is he summarizes all of, again, his superpower is summary. He summarizes all of the mefarshim that he has at his wherewithal, and he summarizes them into simonim, into little chapters as to how to deal with these areas in halacha, not based on the order of the Gemara, based on logical things. So he starts Orach Chaim. How do you wake up in the morning? How do you do Netilas Yadayim? Do you wake up for Tikkun Chatzos in the middle of the night? Right, and he moves there onwards. Right, the Seder Hayom. That's how he organizes it. And what's fascinating about the Rabbeinu Yaakov, like his father, is that he has the ability. He was blessed with persecution, which means to say that he now has access to both German Ashkenazic law and Sephardic law, because he, unlike most of the Rishonim, lived in both areas. So he spent the first 40 plus years of his life in Germany, and thereafterwards he spent in Spain. And those are completely different traditions of halacha. He summarizes both of them. Now, what happens is that after this, the next thing that happens after many people comment on the Arba Turim, on the Tur, then one of the predominant commentators on the Baal HaTur happens to be the Beis Yosef, who writes the Shulchan Aruch based on his framework. Meaning, the Shulchan Aruch is using the Baal HaTurim. Right? So, meaning even the Simonim, the chapter headings of Shulchan Aruch is not Rav Yosef Karo, it is Rabbeinu Yaakov. Our Shulchan Aruch is based on, chapter by chapter, the Tur. What is the Beis Yosef doing? What is the Shulchan Aruch doing that's different to the Tur? All he's doing is paskening, because the Tur did not pasken. The Tur would quote, I heard so-and-so say this, Adoni Avi Mori, my father said that, that's the Rosh, and I give you 3 different opinions, and the Beis Yosef writes a book called the Shulchan Aruch, where he says, this is the practice we do in this case. Right? And then somebody else who commented on the Tur, his name was Rav Moshe Isserles, writes the Ramah, the glosses in the Shulchan Aruch. It all emerges straight from the Baal HaTurim. So the greatest contribution is our system of halacha today, which Rabbeinu Yaakov creates, which is why it's called the Baal HaTur. Tur means the column, because he redivided halacha into 4 columns. Unlike the Rambam, who has 14 sections on halacha, which applies to everything. So the Rambam comments on halachas of war, as an example. The Baal HaTurim says Jews aren't making war right now because we don't have a country. So he omits the halachas of war. He omits the halachas of all kinds of things which don't apply to the average Jew in diaspora, as opposed to the Rambam. So that's one of the things, but that has carried us through the diaspora. So folks, just to appreciate what he's doing. Now we come to his commentary on the Torah. What is he doing in his commentary on the Torah? It's the same methodology, and this is what most people forget. And now we're in a better position to appreciate what's happening. So let's start. What is the point of his commentary on the Torah? He tells us, because he writes an introduction. Like the Spanish commentators write introductions, he lived in Spain, and so at the end of his life, so he wrote an introduction. In it, he explains very clearly what he's doing in his Pirush. And he's doing 2 things. Number 1, take a look at source 6. By the way, at the top of page 5 is where you see an example of the Tur there. This is the beginning of Orach Chaim, and then you see the commentaries on the side, the Beis Yosef, the Bach as well, the Beis Charash. Okay. In source 6, V'nei Isi, this is the middle of his introduction, Yahayam hagadol u'rechav yodayim. I saw this incredible ocean. What's the metaphor for? Pirush haTorah la'Rav hagadol haRamban zal gadol hanoitzav Rav knafeha. He says, I'm looking at the Ramban's commentary. We spent a little bit of time on the Ramban, and he says it's like this ocean of ideas. It's so broad. It's so huge. He says, "V'nafshi oisa ivsa la'avor boy." I wanted to travel through this ocean, but I'm afraid ki gadol ma'od v'goa mayim. But the waves are high and the length is far. V'omer el chali al hasfasayim. Maybe I can dip my feet in the shallows of the Ramban. Okay, so just listen to what he's doing here. He says, Ki al sefosoi atz rav mizeh mizeh nechmad hu la'maskil v'ta'ava la'inayim v'kach mipiryoy maleh kapayim. Notice he's rhyming as well. So I'm going to try to take a little bit in my hands. You can sort of see the humility of how he relates to the Ramban. By the way, we're not living too much later than the Ramban. This is just the next century. So this is the way he's understanding this. So we spent some time on the Ramban, and look, this is his attitude to the Ramban. And he goes on to explain that his explanation is a summary of the Ramban. What is he doing? He's deploying his superpower, not just to the Rosh, not just to the Toysos, but to the Ramban on the Torah. That's what he's doing. Did you know that? The Baal HaTurim is a summary of the Ramban. Who knew that? Here's a perfect example. Let's take a look. Source 8. There's the Ramban on the book on the pasuk in the beginning, or in Bereshis Vav, the beginning of Parshas Noach. It says, God says, I'm bringing this mabul. The Ramban classically first quotes this and brings Rashi at the bottom in source 8, and then he goes on to disagree with Rashi, and then he suggests his own pirush, and then Vala Emes, and then he goes on and brings the Kabbalistic explanation, as we saw the Ramban. What does the Torah do in source 9? Look what he does. He quotes Rashi in one line, he quotes the Ramban in one line, and he goes and makes a suggestion. Do you see what he did? Exactly what he did with the Rosh. He takes a large corpus of material and he summarizes it and adds little pieces himself, but that's what he does. That is what the Baal Haturim was seeking to do on his Pirush on the Torah. So you say, wait a second, but that's not the Torah that I'm aware of. So here's the thing. Here's the interesting thing. Is we call this today the Tur Ha'aruch, the long Torah. Now it's funny because it's longer. It's meaning it's a summary, so it's actually short. But it means to say it is longer than the Torah that we relate to on the Torah. It's a gesund. So what it means to say, if you look at an 1800 Baal HaTurim on the Torah, it will include all of this. Letza'arenu, the Baal HaTurim today is not this. It's actually we'll call it a side note of the entire Pirush. What does that mean? Let's continue in his introduction to the Torah. At the very end of his introduction, after explaining why he's going to summarize the Ramban. And if you ever want to have a good summary of the earlier Mefarshim, the place to look is the Torah Aruch. If you want to understand the Ramban, you go to the Torah and the Rebbe Bechaya, but for the Kabbalistic reason. Let's go, just hang on for a second. Let's go into the end of his introduction in source 10. He says, V'ra'isi, this is the very end of his introduction. Lichtov b'tchila seder v'seder ma'at parparaot migamatriot v'tamei masoros lamshich alev. He said, and in addition to what I'm doing, which is my real work, which is summarizing the Ramban, I'm also going to add a few things in at the beginning, right? I'm going to add a few things in, and he adds a few words there. Then he says, it's lahamshich alev, to draw the heart in. V'asher kol machshavosov lo geluyos, cherker tuchos klayos, v'yodea kol machshavosai, v'yachzik yadai harafos. HaKadosh Baruch Hu should give me the siyad d'shmai, should give me strength to do this. V'yametz birkaya koshlot, HaKadosh Baruch Hu should strengthen my buckling knees. Lo etzi machshavosai zois el ha'poal, that Hashem should allow me to finish this. V'yatelev avili v'yakarveni elav arasai, v'ya'irenai b'ma'or l'tarasai, Hashem should allow me to do this. And enlighten my eyes to be able to finish this material. So what is this section? He says at the beginning of every parsha, I'm going to add a few things with we'll call extra value, like hints. What's called b'derech remez. That is the extra of the secondary to it. And letzareno, if you think about a Baal HaTurim today, the Baal HaTurim is only that. Meaning the Baal HaTurim classically in most printed books today is like the Art Scroll version is only that. It's just a commentary on only that part of it. Most Baal HaTurims that we have today are just an explanation of this piece of it as well. If you want to find the Torah Aruch is eminently available. You can go online, you can find it. The Safari has the full text of it, and it's very helpful. It's a pity to me that we lost what his main point of the book was, and we sort of focused on the secondary. But the secondary is not to be lost upon us. Rosemary, and then I need to.
Not only myself, but someone else. Why do you think you had to summarize something?
Oh, so the truth is that everybody has incredible skills, and what he contributed was allowing us access to things. Think about today for the moment, right now. We have a lot of knowledge available, right? Most people are too lazy to access that knowledge, right? So that's the reality of the human condition. So we pay subscriptions to people who we allow to mediate that knowledge all the time, right? So we allow newspapers to mediate the knowledge of what's going on around us with all their bias and interpretation. And in fact, most people don't even read articles anymore. They just read headlines. And in fact, reading newspapers is even not good enough. Now we just get them through social media, which means that we're relying more and more on other people to mediate this. What he's doing is he's summarizing, and I would say probably for himself, and happens to be he's allowing other people in, this is how he's processing information. What we would all do very well if we were to summarize the Ramban ourselves. But it happens to be there's also the secondary market, which is the people who are going to be reading this and benefiting from this, we call more global summary, and he's also adding in his own ideas. But I understand that he's not starting by himself, he's a summary. So I think there's a great value added. Now, I want to move into this next section. And no, hang on. Sorry, I got so much I want to cover. I really don't want to. I'm going to have to reserve all questions to the end because it's just this. Really don't want to lose this. A huge amount of effort went into this. So let's someone please write down the questions because there's just so much here. So now, when we think of the Torah again, the word that pops into mind is the word gematria. I want to disavow everybody. That is one of many things the Baal Haturim in this part of the book is doing. It is only one. And I want to come back to what he's really trying to do, but let's examine a number of the things that he does. And what he's going to be doing is he's going to be analyzing aspects of the text which we may have just overlooked. And he's going to give meaning to what's called remez, which means the way that the text conveys meaning in ways other than simply the words itself. And there's many ways that it does such. It is worthwhile noting there is a suggestion that this pirush was written in a quick manner. So just take a look at source 11, the Kol Dodi Rav Yaakov Koppel Reinitz. One of the many Mefarshim on the Baal Haturim says, "B'chdei revach hasipur ki Rabbeinu chiber par oisov b'layla echad." He quotes the Kol Dodi, who says that he authored this book that we're working on in one night. Right? He says, "V'chein muva b'sefer Kol Dodi." Okay, v'zeh lashona pam achas hochiach harosh zatzal es benoi Rabbeinu Yaakov Baal Haturim al shekol isukov enom ela b'torah sheba'al peh bilvad ve'eno oisek b'torah shebichsav nosana dvarim el liboyu v'leil chamishi b'shabbos yoshava kol halala v'chiber is svoroi al haTorah. So it goes that his father said to him, "How come you're spending all your time on the oral Torah, meaning the Gemara, the Halacha, and so on, but you have not spent time on the written Torah?" And so one Thursday night, he stayed up all night and he wrote this. Now, folks, what we're about to examine over here, I don't know if we could spend a lifetime having put this together. This is so complex. But let's try to see over here. So let's look at a few methods of remez. The first is very simple. Is what we call acronym. Acronym is what's called Roshei Tevos. It itself is a Roshei Tevos. You usually see it as Reish apostrophe Taf, which means Roshei Tevos. That itself is an acronym. Let's take a look at a very simple one. This is a very famous one. The beginning of the book of Shmois is Ve'ele Shmois b'nei Yisrael abai Mitzrayim es Yaakov ishu be'saybo. That's the first pasuk in Shmois. Says the Baal Haturim, Rabbeinu Yaakov. He says Roshei Tevos. This is in fact the acronym for Ve'adam asher lomeid haseder shnayim mikra ve'echad targum b'kol na'im yashir yechyeh shanim rabois arukim la'olam. Okay, so just understand what he just did over here. Okay, so the first four words of it in source 13, the first four words are made up of all these letters. He gives you a consistent sentence which relates to the halacha of reading the parasha every week, twice over in text and once in targum, and the blessing being it will live many years. Now I'm going to come back to this as well. He's not just making this up. We'll get to where he's getting this from. But this is one very famous method that he'll use, which is what's called Roshei Tevos. But we are far from done, because then he uses another method which is called Sofei Tevos. So Sofei Tevos is not using the first letter of every word, but the last letter of every word. So for instance, let's take the first pasuk of the Torah. Bereshis bara Elokim es hashamayim v'ha'aretz. I'm sure we all naturally picked up on this, that the Sofei Tevos of the first is MS, right? Is truth, right? Bereshis, Taf, Aleph, Mem, is the acronym MS, not in that order. And then he goes on to say, what is the meaning of this? Melamed shebara ha'olam be'emes. The signature of God is truth, and that's how I created it. Rosh Tvarcha MS, that's what it means when it says the beginning of your words is truth. In the Pasuk in Tehillim, what does it mean, the Rosh Tvarcha, the beginning of your words? It means the first three words of the Torah, Rosh Tvarcha MS, which means how do you see truth in the first three words? The last letters, right? Then he goes on to say, Bara Elokim Es, which means the next three words, Sofei Tevos MS, Vayar Elokim Es, Sofei Tevos MS, Vayivro Elokim Es, Sofei Tevos MS, Vayar Elokim Es, Sofei Tevos MS, Bara Elokim La'asos, Sofei Tevos MS. V'lo'achen tiknu v'ov pamim MS be'emes v'yatzim. Which means, if Tehillim tells us that Rosh Tvarcha MS, that the beginning of your words, God, is truth, that means truth must be found at the beginning of the book. So I'm going to look in chapter 1, and I'll tell you every time that there are three words together in consecutive order, which their Sofei Tevos will yield MS, and it appears 6 times in the first chapter, which is why in MS V'yatziv, in our davening, it says 6 times the word MS, because MS, in fact, appears, the word truth appears 6 times at the beginning of the Torah. Now, I just noticed something over here is he's not saying, oh, let me try to find what the last letters of the word is. He knows already where he's going, right? He knows where his starting point is. He knows there's truth at the beginning of the Torah, and the seal of God is there in truth. So I'm just going to uncover it and show you where it is as one example, okay? So this is classic. Now, we, in reading this, we completely lose this because, when I teach in high school, I give psukim and I give translation. And it's such a pity to give translation because, of course, every defaults to the path of least resistance. And so all the girls read the English. If you're reading English, you have no idea. You just missed all of this, right? Right? In the beginning, God created. Did you just get that the Torah is conveying to you MS? Did you get to convey to you that the Rosh Hashanah? No, you missed all of that. That's all. Well, what it means to say is the Torah conveys meaning in multiple bandwidths, in multiple layers. One is through the words themselves, but there's many other ways of conveying it. Let's go a little further.
You're saying that the boys don't go to Catholic least?
No, I teach in a girls' high school. I teach in a girls' high school. I can tell you that the boys have even less gumption. Okay, so I'm just saying, if people don't have the ability to sit and say, let me invest a little bit of energy into translation, so I will actually be proficient in Hebrew, so that I'll actually be a professional Jew, right? So, but the point, no, I'm saying that's how we're training our kids. So it's a real pity because you're missing more than 90% of the meaning if you're just translating it. Now let's get other examples as well. Just this is another example of this. Actually, this is a new heading as well. This is a new topic. Is not just the numbers, not just the L'Sofet Tevos. This is what's called mispar, the number of words. What does that mean? Listen to this remarkable observation he makes. In Parshas Pekudei, there's a number of times this phrase appears, which is Kasher Tzivah Hashem Es Moshe. As God commanded Moshe, He set up the Mishkan. Beautiful. It happens to be, everybody notices this, right? And all the classic Rishonim talk about the fact that the Mishkan was made exactly to the T in terms of design. The Baal Haturim has an extra observation to make. And this is in source 17 in the last paragraph. He says, Kasher Tzivah Hashem Es Moshe, Ksiv al kol davar v'davar. This phrase is written on every moment, every command of the making the Mishkan. Keneged ma she'amar Moshe mecheni na misifrecha harba lahazkiroi. Meaning, Moshe Rabbeinu says, remove me from your book. So Hashem kept on saying, Kasher Tzivah Hashem Es Moshe, as Moshe is included. Now he points out, did you count how many times that phrase appears? This is what I did. He says, V'heim yurches pa'amim. There's 18 times that the phrase Kasher Tzivah Hashem appears. He says, V'kol asher tzivah Hashem Es Moshe. And there's an extra phrase which is a slight variation, which means a 19th time. Kenegdam tiknu yudches barachos. So when Anshe Knesset Gdola were formulating how the prayer would look of the Amidah, they used the 18 times and the 19th variation, which is the 19th bracha of the Shemona Esrei. That's the framework, that's the format. Why? What's it got to do with the Mishkan? Because Bilbavi, Mishkan Evne, I'm making the sanctuary to God in my prayers, so it's going to reflect the way I created the Mishkan, which is the 18/19 times, but we are not done yet. Then he says, V'acha kasher tzivah Hashem v'chein asu, v'tiknu kenegdam birkas haminim v'yesh b'hem kuf yud gimel tevos. Did you count the number of words in all 19 times? Well, there are 113 words if you add up all those phrases. V'chein b'soifei habrachos, baruch atah Hashem mogen Avram, baruch atah Hashem mechayim esim, u'bod kuf yud gimel tevos. Did you count the closing of every bracha in the Shemona Esrei? Remarkably, there are 113 words in that too. Right, which means to say, clearly that was being framed on this. And by the way, if you are counting, the word heart appears 113 times in all of Chumash from Bereshis Bara to Lenei Kol Yisrael. That in that. So again, let's do a quick summary over here. He notices this phrase appears 18 times with the 19th variation. Says, well, clearly, there's a construction of we'll call it a liturgy of which is reflecting this. And if you think this is random, the words actually parallel in the summary, the closing of every bracha. If you make a mistake in the middle of the bracha and you close it right, it's still halachically valid. So in the chasim of every bracha, there's 113 words to this as well. Okay, so I'm sure that most of us missed this piece when we're learning the Chumash. But understand that this is when meaning is being conveyed, it's being conveyed in multiple dimensions over here, and we should not trivialize what happens as well. Let's go a little further. There's also unusual letters. So, for instance, in the pasuk we say Shema Yisrael Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad. Reread it in a siddur, so we don't notice that if you look at the way it's written in the Torah, what's unusual about it? The ayin and the daled are enlarged, right? And of course, many people comment on this, but of course, the Baal Haturim himself, of course, says daled gedola lamar lecha she tamlicheh b'shamayim v'aretz v'daled ruchos ha'olam. We're supposed to say that God is everywhere, so we're thinking at least laterally, right? So I'm thinking in all directions, 4, and of course the letter daled is of course 2 axi, right? It's the x and y axis, so it's 4 dimensions, right? Sorry, 4 directions in the 2-dimensional plane. And then he says, he says, he talks about not davar acher. This is the point. He says, ayin v'daled gedola. The ayin and the daled are big. Hare eid. This is a testimony. V'zeu atem eidayin u'mashem. You are my witnesses. Meaning, in shul every morning, when we put our hands over our eyes and we say, Shema Yisrael Hashem Eloheinu Hashem Echad, we are also aid. The ayin and the daled, which are larger, we are testifying to the fact that God is here. That's what we're doing every day. Atem edai, you are my witnesses, O Israel. We're doing that every single morning by committing this line, by saying Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu Hashem Echad as well. That's what we're doing, which is why the Torah expresses this by having larger letters, which is why the tradition of the Torah, which is written today, if you look in the Torah itself, has those 2 enlarged letters. Okay, and this he does it in every place. There's an unusual letter. We'll get to some other examples in a moment. He also comments on what's called malei v'chaser. What is malei v'chaser? Is certain words which sound the same, mean the same, but have different amounts of letters in them. What does that mean? Well, there is, let's say, for instance, when you have the a cholam, right? A cholam could be a cholam with a vav and a dot above it, or just a dot above it in terms of the nekudas. You can have a chirik, which is chirik yud, or just chirik without the yud, which means to say it's the same sound. Is there a yud or a vav in that word? Doesn't really make a difference in pronunciation, doesn't make a difference in meaning, but it actually, the Torah will have different variations. Similarly, sometimes there'll be an aleph in a word and it will be omitted, and the word doesn't change in terms of pronunciation or meaning necessarily. Every time that happens, almost every time, the Baal Haturim, not every time, but the Baal Haturim will often draw our attention to it. For instance, he has a very famous one. It describes in the creation of the human being, by Yitzer, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu created the human being, and it has 2 yuds in it, in source 20. And he comments on this. Why is it 2? Because he says, malei, it is full in the line, sheyesh lo shnei yetzarim. Because the human being is guided by 2 inclinations. The inclination to loftiness, to patience, to morality, to the divine, and the inclination towards earthliness and materialism. So a person is created as such. Now you think we're just playing games over here. When it says the same word that Hashem created the animals, it says it with 1 yud. Which means to say that the animal is not gifted with we'll call it a divine consciousness or morality or self-reflection, which is reflected in the words itself, in whether it's malei or chaser. Right? So another example over here. Now, by the way, there's a lot of work that's spent on this in preserving what's malei and chaser, and there are some deviants in the text throughout the course of the generations. But the Baal Haturim is going to consistently draw attention to the meaning that is embedded in parts of the text, which we didn't even notice because, first of all, we don't hear or know the difference in translation as well. Another example, this is what's called kri uksiv. The Torah is written one way, and we pronounce it a different way. We have the oral tradition is that we pronounce it slightly different. Very simple example here. It describes that when Yosef was placed in prison, he was placed in the Makom in source 23, Asher, Asirei, Hamelech, Asurim. The captives of the king were incarcerated. But the way it's written is Asure, not Asirei, not with a yud, but with a vav. So the Baal Haturim makes observation in source 24. Asurei ksiv, the way it's written is those who are forbidden. V'asirei kri, but the way we read it is asirei, those who are incarcerated. Melamed sheyud shanim haya asur ad shoytzi diba al yud achiv v'oid beis shanim al shomar l'sara mashkim kiim zachartani. There's a yud there to indicate that he stayed 10 years in jail, as tradition tells us, because he slandered his 10 brothers. Now, we're not blaming the victim here, right? There was a lot of complexity. They're going to get their own day in court, right? But the point is he's saying, is the Torah is conveying to us that part of the reason he's in jail for the 10 years is because of what led him to the jail, which was his relationship to his brothers. That's why the 10 years and 10 brothers. Okay, he obviously wasn't slandering Binyamin, his youngest brother. Another example of where he draws out, so that again is where you have the written and the read diverging from each other. This happens all the time in the Torah. There's so many instances of this. And he's going to draw our attention to the meaning behind those as well. Another example is tagim, which are crowns. So he makes the observation as over here. The following, this is a very famous pasuk in Ha'azinu, says, Kiloi davar reik hu mikem. The Torah is not empty of you. And the Baal Haturim says, Ki loy davareku tagin ala kuf. There's a crown on the kuf. Nomar shafilu ala tagin shel Torah tale tilim shel halachos. The Gemara tells us in Eruvin that there are mountains and mountains of meaning just from the crowns in the Torah. Now, if you look at the actual text of this, I don't see a crown. There's like a little spike right over there. But the comment, it's worthwhile noting that, for instance, on the next page, this is the Rav Yaakov Reinitz's commentary on the Baal Haturim. He points out that the Torah is acknowledging certain traditions that had greater posterity in terms of the Torah itself, which had crowns on letters which we don't have the tradition for anymore. Meaning we've lost some of that in the Torahs that we have, in many of the Torahs we have. And at the bottom of page 9, I placed a list of what those tagin would look. Usually in the Torah, there are tagin, there are crowns on what's called shatnez gates, which means all the letters of that acronym, shatnez gates, shin, right? Ayin have crowns, but pei is not one of them. So he's acknowledging that this particular pei has tagin on it. And what it would look like is the bottom right corner there with you notice the three crowns sticking up. That's what it should look like. And it's acknowledged that the Torahs that we have today, many of them don't have the same level of care given to them in terms of the tradition of where those crowns actually belong. And the Baal Haturim will often also tell us how many crowns. So, for instance, by the death of the two sons of Aaron, he talks about the fact that there's 2 crowns as opposed to 3, meaning there's only 2 sticking up, which relates to the fact that they were killed as they breathed in. Right? There were two lines of energy which entered into them. There's a lot of things which will relate to even with the shape of the crown in unnecessary places as well. Right? When we talk about the Gemara Menachos about Rebbe Akiva, who saw HaKadosh Baruch Hu, Moshe Rabbeinu seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu tying crowns to the letters and realizing that there's going to be many levels of meaning, that's what we're referring to over here in this respect, and the Baal Haturim is going to acknowledge this. Similarly, big letters as well, like for instance, the Torah page 9, Vis Galach, Ves Nesaga Alo Yagalech, that's a big gimel in the Torah, and the Baal Haturim also gimel Gedolah, She gimel Tzrichim Giluach. He points out that there are 3 times in the Torah that the Torah requires shaving yourself for purity. There are 3 types of people, and who are they? B'chol Makom, he says Nazir, Mitzora, and Leviim. So that's why the Torah gives a big gimel to notice there are 3 people who do this, right? So it's meaning the Torah is conveying to us in code that this affects 3 people as well. Bent letters as well. So for instance, the Torah says on top of page 10, Moshe Rabbeinu is told that in Parshas Vayeschanan, V'ata poi amoid imodi, you should stay here with me. The Baal Haturim acknowledges that that first of all there's tagin on the pei. That pei also has crowns in it, but he also points out that the word imadi, the yud in imadi, is what's called a yud kefufa, a bent yud. Now I don't know if that's just like lower than the line in our tikkun, or we've lost this tradition as well. But he points out that the yud is bent over, so it's slightly bent over. In tradition, with Moshe Rabbeinu, when you stay with me, you're going to stay like the Yud, which is humble and bent over. So even the shapes of the letters are going to relate to the meaning in the Psukim as well. Cantillation, that means to say that he's going to notice another level of meaning, which is in the trop, how we actually enunciate the words with tune. So, for instance, he'll catch unusual ones. When it describes the death of the children of Aaron, in Vayikra Perek Yud, in source 27, the 3rd line there in this tikkun, I put in Vayomer Alehem Kirvu. Notice that over there is a circle above the letter and 2 lines. That's what's called, those are 2 separate levels of cantillation merged together on one trop. Shalom, how would that go?
Actually, you read it out of order.
Okay, yeah.
Because the way there's a rule that the Lisha Gedola is always printed at the beginning of the word, despite the fact that the trup is actually put later, and the gershom is the end of the word, so you actually read it in reverse.
Good. Good. Thank you. Because this is a very this is almost a hapex that going on, which means it's almost one. There's 2 in the Torah that appear like this. We have 2 sets of trup on the one word. By the way, so this is not a non-simple trup. That's why he's commenting, and he makes the observation. Of course, the Baal Haturim comments on this. In Psalms 20, the bottom is 27, he says, Kirvu yesh boy beis ta'amim. There's 2 tunes on one word. He says, this teaches us, Sheloi kirvu aleim la'echal, elotir boleim chanis shel barzel v'garurum v'otzio esami lachutz. Right, they used an iron pole to drag them out. Right, they couldn't actually touch them themselves as they were killed in the innermost sanctum as well. Meaning to say that there's an abnormality in the way this tune is conveying the abnormality of the way they accessed the dead their dead brothers who had died inside the Kodesh Kodashim, right? So even the cantillation is conveying a different level of meaning over here as well. So there's multiple channels of meaning. Now, the one that I think that most people are not aware of, and this is the biggest place, this is the biggest area that the Baal Haturim makes works in, is not Gematria, it's in Masoris. What is Masoris? Most people have no idea about this. This is why it's so important. On the bottom of the page, I'm not going to go into the Gemara over here, but the Gemara in Kedushin there's a certain group of people called Sofrim. We call a Sofer today a person who writes Tefillin and Mezuzahs and Torahs, right? That's not what a Sofer refers to in the Gemara. The Sofer is the people who would count letters. What does that mean? How do we know that the Torah we have today is in fact the Torah that was given at Sinai? So we did a share on this a few years ago, and one of the reasons is because from the times of Moshe Rabbeinu till now, until certainly the printing press, there were people who were called Sofrim, and their tradition, their family tradition, was to protect the posterity of the Torah. All the letters, everything needs to add up, and they in fact wrote manuscripts in order to preserve these as well. There were families whose tradition was, so for instance, there was a family in the Tiberia and Tiberias called the Ben Asher family, the Rambam acknowledges. Their family was in charge of making sure that the Torah that is being printed every time it's being written, being written, is the same Torah. And so what did they do? They didn't just write Torahs, they wrote manuscripts with codes on them in order to be able to make sure to compare that to the next Torah being written, to ensure that everything is exact, not even a letter's missing. And so, for instance, the three most famous of these manuscripts, this is well before the printing press, the most famous of them is what's called the Aleppo Codex, which is called Keter Aram Tzova. Aram Tzova is Aleppo. The Keter means the crown, because it was the greatest and most accurate of all the other codexes they had. And this one dates back well over 1,000 years. This, in fact, is assumed to, people make the assumption as to this is the one that the Rambam had when he was in the Yad, was talking about the Torah that he had in front of him. There's argument as to what that is. You can visit the Aleppo Codex today in Jerusalem. It is available online. It's available as a book. You can actually see it as well. The biggest tragedy is we're missing most of the Torah. We have the rest of Tanakh, but from Kisavoy, as of yesterday, that's where it starts. Where the rest is, read Matti Freeman's Aleppo Codex, the intrigue and the dark history in the last 75 years as to what happened to the extra parts of the Torah. There's a lot of intrigue around that. But be it as it may, the Aleppo Codex is what we have. It's worthwhile noting that the Aleppo Codex is not the only codex that we have today. We have the Leningrad manuscript, which is slightly later, only 1,000 years old, which is also available, very easily accessible. And just recently, if you're watching, in last year, there was another codex, which is early in the Aleppo Codex, called the Ben Sasson Codex, which was sold for how much? They bought it for, was it $30 million on auction? Just, I don't remember the numbers, and they donated it to Anu, to the... It's at Anu, right? So it's now new. This is the latest thing, and it's the earliest codex we have, the Ben Sasson Codex. It was a big thing because there was a complexity as into that auction, who was going to be bidding. There was a very, if you go back a year, there was a lot of complexity into that auction. These are things that are worth a lot of money. Forget, and for us, it's much more than money. It's tradition, and here's an example of just understanding of what it looks like. So this is from the beginning of Shmos in the Leningrad Codex. I quoted the Leningrad Codex because we don't have the Aleppo Codex on this one. But notice here the Pesukim Vayelech Im Shbeis Levi. Notice that there is actually trop cantillation, and there is also vowelization. But more importantly for us is take a look in the right hand column. Do you see that little letter there? There's a base at the top of page 12. That little base. That little base then relates to, there's a little circle above the word Vayelech Ish, which means those Masoretes were noting that the word Vayelech Ish appears what? 2 times in all of Tanakh. All of the 24 books of Tanakh, this phrase only appears 2 times. And now the way of memorizing it would be wait a second, that means to say that we need to make sure that there's no other time it appears, right? And then you'll notice other codes along the side. The Lamed with a dot on it means Lesa, which means it's a Hapax Legomenon, which means it only appears 1 time in this form in all of Tanakh, and the dot of that one goes over there to the word, which went to Atitz Benehu. Okay? So this is what I mean. There was Sofer, the Sofer mean they would count letters. This is what it looked like. Notice that on certain Chumashim, the older Mikras Gedolos, they have what's called a Mesorah Gedola and a Mesorah Katana, which summarizes and explains this. So what does that mean? In the Mesorah Gedola, in the old Chumashim, we don't have these Chumashim, people aren't aware of it. The Mesorah Gedola explaining this says, Vayelech Ish mi Beis Levi. Beis, that means 2 times it appears in Tanakh. What are they? Simon, Vayelech Ish Beis Levi, and it says, mi Beis Lechem Yehuda. There was a man who went from the house of Bethlehem, and that is in the Sefer of Rus. Megillas Rus is the only parallel phrase to Vayelech Ish Mibeis Levi, and that is Vayelech Ish Mibeis Lechem Yehuda. And that's what the Masoretes are saying. That's all they're saying. Why do they note this? Because they're trying to keep the posterity of the Torah. Says the Baal Haturim, but there's meaning to it too. Meaning, the Baal Haturim is contributing the meaning behind the fact that the Masoretic texts are linking. So says the Baal Haturim in Source 81. Meaning, when Amram went and remarried Yocheved, that was going to create the savior. What was happening with the whole business of Elimelech and Boaz and Rus? Was the production of Rus, of Oved, to ultimately Yishai, who's going to produce David, which is the next round of Messiah, which means thematically, here we have two people living their lives, which is now generating the Messiah. That's what the Baal Haturim is saying. So meaning he's going to take, and this is what he does most frequently. More than Gematria, the Baal Haturim will note the Masoretic text and say, this is the meaning in the linked psukim. It's almost like a hyperlink today, right? But this was long before they had any technology. These are people who spent their entire lives ensuring the posterity to the Torah. It's remarkable. It's remarkable. And he's giving meaning to all of that. Just folks, you need to say wow for this. I mean, this is just like, meaning, here, look, first of all, the fact that people, this is the way this is preserved, and the security around these manuscripts. This is why it's so remarkable that the Keter actually lost pages, right? Because that was in transition to Israel. There was something happened, right? From Aleppo in the riots in 1947 to Israel, right? Because it was saved. There were people who risked their lives and died to save the Keter, and it's needed to get to Israel. But this itself is giving meaning to it. The Torah is not just conveying messages in the words, not just in the acronyms or the Sofei Tevos, not just in the big or unusual letters, not just in the crowns, not just in the cantillations and the exceptions in the cantillation, not just in the extra letters, the Kriyal Ksivs, but also, in fact, in the linked words, the phrases and appearances of words which appear matching. How do we find that? In the Masorah, in the Masoretic text, by the Sofrim, and that also has meaning as well. So now think about this. The Torah is conveying meaning in so many dimensions, and it takes a lot to appreciate what's actually going on. Okay, let's go a little further. Gematria, finally, we'll close with this. Gematria, you say, wow, it's all these games. Well, it's not games. Right, so first of all, the Mishnah in Pirkei Avos calls the idea is of Gematria in the fourth parak is Gematrios are what's called paraos lechochma. Right, sometimes they translate it as a dessert, as like a sort of a taste to wisdom. But it's funny because that may dismiss it. But if you look in what's called the Mishnah's Rabbi Eliezer, we know that Rabbi Shmuel has 13 ways of derivation, what's called hermeneutical tools of derivation of the Torah. Turns out that Rabbi Eliezer ben Chasma had 33, and of them, Gematria is one of them, which means the Torah conveys meaning in multiple levels. One of them is Gematria, so not to take this less seriously. As an example, one of the most famous Gematrias that everybody should know, but they don't realize it is, how do we know that there are 613 mitzvahs in the Torah? And everybody writes books about this. The Rambam writes a book, right? There's the Bahag writes a book, the Smag writes a book. Well, how do we know there's 613 mitzvahs? The Gemara in Makos tells us because the Gematria of the word Torah is 611. Right, Torah? 406. 205 is 611. And the Torah Tziva Lanu Moshe. Moshe taught us 611. Why? Because the first two of the Aseres Dibros were transmitted to us directly from God. We said we couldn't handle it. The rest of the Torah was given by Moshe Rabbeinu, which means two of the first Aseres Dibros plus the 611 is 613. And this is not seen as a dessert, right? Because entire books were written on this topic of those 613, right? So just to put things in perspective. And by the way, this is not the Baal Haturim. This is the Gemara. The Gemara makes an assumption. The Gemara uses Gematria multiple times to convey meaning. That's how we know there's 630 mitzvahs is Gematria itself. I put this over here in the table as well. One of my favorite Gematrias of all time is that same passage we looked at before in 36, which is Kilyo Dover Reku Mikem. The Torah is not an empty matter. And in fact, Rabbeinu Paltiel on the Torah says that the Gematria of those words, Kilyo Dover Reku Mikem, is the word Gematrios. Meaning, it is not an empty matter, is the same numeric value as the word Gematrios. Okay, just don't think that is itself empty and devoid of meaning as well. Let's just take a few points over here, and that is that the Baal Haturim will do this many times. One of the things which I think people get people a little bit disillusioned is how gematrias are calculated. There are many different ways. Generally speaking, you just take the numeric value of the letters and you add them up, right? But there happens to be multiple different ways as well. So the one of them is what's called ima kolel. There are other ways of measuring gematrias as well. Ima kolel means to say that the unit itself, so if it's a word, will also contribute 1. So people always say, oh, you see, gematrias, they're 1 off, you're all allowed. It's no, it's not this 1 off. So the unit itself contributes. There are other ways that can contribute to the gematria as well. For instance, you could do a gematria where it accounts the numeric value of the letters and accounts the number of words and accounts the number of letters too. Meaning there are other contributing factors to gematrias, and one of them has to be ima kolel, which is the actual unit itself. But let's not to say ourselves, oh, it's sort of like a loose science. There are other ways of getting to this as well. Let's take another example. The most famous system over here is what's called the Atbash system. Atbash system is where you reverse the alphabet on itself and you actually insert we'll call it the parallel letter in the reversed alphabet. So take a look at the chart at the bottom of 14. Aleph is a taf, Beis is a shin, Gimel is a resh. So it's called the Atbash Gardak system. If you want to move down, the At is the Aleph and the taf. The Beis is the Beis and the shin. The Gimel is the resh, right? So if you flip those. And we use this all the time. We don't even realize we've done this. So for instance, when that famous Rashi says that it describes Yaakov Avinu comes back to Esau and he sends a message and he says, Im Lavon Garti, I'm stayed with Lavon and I stayed until this time. Rashi says that in fact the gematria of Garti is Tariag Mitzvahs. Meaning, what does it mean? Im Lavon Garti Tariag Mitzvahs Shamarti. And I kept the Tariag Mitzvahs. Rashi says, how do you know that? The word Garti is gematria Taf Resh Yud Gimel 613. Not really. It's only if you use the Atbash system. Meaning, when you flip the letters, then you get the Atbash as well. The Baal Haturim does this many times as well, so it's 44. It says in the Bris Bet Abasarim, it says, B'mei Eida, Avram Avinu asks Hashem, how will I know that I'll inherit? How do I know that I have a child? Says the Baal Haturim, the word B'mei, the question word, is in fact in the Atbash system is Shin Yud Tzadi, right? So replace the Beis with the Shin, the Mem with the Yud, the Hey with the Tzadi, because that's the flipping of the letter. Invert that, take the gematria that gives us 400. Says the Baal Haturim that in the Atbash system we're going to get that in fact because he asked, there were 400 years. Meaning that was the 400 years of servitude decreed, which was about to be decreed in the Bris Bet Abasarim because of the question itself, which is in the Bameh, which means it's conveying meaning not just in a linear fashion, but as well. Now, there are different ways of working the system as well. So, for instance, there's what's called the Nistar. Nistar is another way of conveying gematria. Just to appreciate this, here's a very simple example of where the Baal Haturim says this. He says the word Yosef, the name, is b'milu'oi b'gematria b'chora, is the firstborn right. Now, he's commenting over here where Reuven loses his firstborn right, because Reuven is a gematria lo b'chor. He lost his firstborn right. Now, if you do, what does it mean, milu'ah? That means to say is you unpack the word itself. So that means the word Yosef, if you add it up, is going to be Yud Vav Samach Pei, which is going to be 20, 12, 120, and 81, which is going to be by itself 156. That does not equal Bechorah. Milu'ah means to say you unpack each letter and then take the gematria of each letter. So as opposed to looking at just letters Yud, Vav, Samach Pei, you now look at Yud as Yud, Vav, Dalet. I've spelled out the word Yud. I now take the word Vav, Vav, Vav. I now take the word Samach, Mem, Chav, Pei, Aleph. Add that all up, you get 233, which is the same as Bechorah, which means that the word, it's been conveying meaning below and above the line itself as well. Very famous one, by the way, is the Vilna Gaon says, is the word Siyum is the same in the Nistar and the Nigla, which means, if I take the gematria of the word Siyum, actually just the letters you see, it is the same value as to the hidden letters of spelling out those letters. So Samach, as an example, the word Samach is 60, but if I spell out the word Samach, it's Samach Mem Chav. Mem Chav is 40 and 20, which is 60, which means the revealed expression of the letter is the same as it's hidden. Vav is Vav Vav, which means 6, right? Siyum, right? Vav Vav, Yud is Yud, the Yud is a 10, and a Vav Dalet is 4 and 6, which is 10. So meaning to say that we'll call the compact and expanded meaning as well is going to now folks, we're not going to go into this now because there's no time to do this, but understand that there's many other systems of gematria as well which are employed. So for instance, there's the Album, the Ayek Bachar, there's the Achas Bata, and the Atbach. There's many other different systems, which means to say is that you can turn the Hebrew alphabet, adding in the Sophios as the extra hundreds, which means the 5 final letters, and then turn it into a system of 3, and you superimpose the 3 systems over each other with a parallel of each of the 3 systems, the 27 letters of the full extended alphabet. Right? There's multiple levels of using gematria here, which should humble us when going to those websites to just trying to find the words, right? And trying to figure out a meaning. The Baal Turim doesn't usually do this, but you'll see this in the writings of the Chida, in the Chomas Hanach. You'll see this in the writings of the Maharal. You'll see this in the writings of the Vilna Gaon. Later on, in the expansion of these systems of gematria and meaning. There's even another system of gematria just to be aware of, which is what's called mispar ktana, which means you drop the zeros. What does that mean? If I have the letter Resh, which is 200, I drop the zeros and it's really a 2. Right? So if you do that, actually the gematria of Moshe and Akiva is the same. Right? That's fascinating because Rabbi Akiva and Moshe have a very unique relationship. In the mispar ktana, they actually are the same number. Okay, so it means to say that there's multiple channels of meaning which are being conveyed, and it's not just sitting there with a computer and saying, oh, what can I figure out is the numbers, because he wasn't doing that. And that leads me to the concluding point, and I would like to finish this because it's exquisite. What is the Baal Turim really doing? If you have a regular Baal Turim, you won't realize. And I want to thank actually Moshe gave me this Baal Turim, which is great. This one is it's expansive. Who does the footnotes on this one? Because there's many Mefarshim. This is Rav Yaakov Koppel Reinitz, and the Ideris writes on the Rav Tumim Rabinowitz, the father-in-law of Cook, writes on this one. Take a look at the last two things, the last two observations on page 15, and I just want to understand what he's really doing, because I think this is, we've all been playing games up till now, in just showing what he does, but to understand what he's really truly doing. Look at these two psukim. The beginning of Parshas Tazria, and I'll close with this, and that is the following. He says, what does it mean? B'yom hashmini, he says, Pasuk ze yesh bo tevos v'oisios k'moy shebepasuk vayachulu. Do you notice the same amount of words and letters in the pasuk of giving a bris is in the first word of the pasuk about Shabbos. Do you notice that? Of course, right? We should have noticed that. The same amount of words and letters, right? Well, that's not just a game. Why is that? It's because Lomar Shemila Doche Shabbos. Because, of course, Bris Milah overrides Shabbos. Meaning you can't do operations on Shabbos, right? Unless it's life-threatening, right? But a Bris Milah you can. Right? Then let's go further. He says, B'yom hashmini yom b'sar asol gematria shekol hayom yeh kasher lamul. All day you can do the milah. The last one, the word is ushloshim yom ushloshis yamim. It says gematria kulam samuchim v'lo mufuzarim. The days of purity and impurity after birth is in fact consecutive and not sporadic. Notice over here, every one of the three things that we looked at over here, what is in parentheses afterwards is a Gemara or a Medrash halacha, which means, what is the Baal Turim really doing? The Baal Turim was not sitting there saying, wouldn't it be nice to find an idea? Hey, you know what? Look at that. If I just manipulate the numbers, I can get... No. It was the opposite. What the Baal Turim was doing was he's using the same superpower he did in every other aspect of his life, which was summary. What is he doing? He's saying, I'm looking at the halacha as it relates to this pasuk. I've learned the Gemara in Christus. I've learned the Gemara in Shabbos and Rebbe Eliezer Mirror. I've learned all these halachas. And I know that they're relating to these psukim. How are these psukim conveying that end in the first place? The Baal Turim was not saying ex nihilo, I'm suggesting an idea. Almost every single gematria that the Baal Turim suggests has a parenthesis afterwards in this version, showing you the words in the Gemara that he is actually attributing to the numbers. What is he doing? He's showing how halacha is being conveyed in numbers. That's what's happening. He has the end in mind before he starts. That's what he's doing. That's remarkable. Now you have a full appreciation of what's going on over here. It's with a lot more humility, I think, than sometimes is given the Baal Turim, which is seen as sort of like an extra, an ancillary mefarish. I really think that it behooves us to appreciate this incredible contribution. Thank you so much, everybody, for